Most people imagine the world after nuclear war as a uniform wasteland. Ash-covered continents, empty cities. A planet rendered equally uninhabitable from pole to pole. This vision comes from movies, from Cold War propaganda, from the comfortable fiction that total destruction would at least be fair. But that's not how it works. When the exchanges end, when the last warhead detonates, when radiation levels begin their slow decline from lethal to merely dangerous, the world that remains is not empty. It's fragmented. Some nations collapse within days. Others endure, transformed but functional. The differences between survival and dissolution are determined not by military strength or economic size, but by geography, infrastructure resilience, and the particular vulnerabilities each country carries into the conflict. The map of Earth remains. The borders drawn on it become suggestions. Power redistributes according to older rules, the ones that governed human civilization before globalization, made everyone dependent on everyone else. Water matters more than weapons. Agricultural land outweighs gold reserves. Distance from detonation sites becomes the most valuable national resource. This is what countries would look like after World War III. Not erased, reorganized, operating under constraints that make the old world unrecognizable. The transformation would not be immediate or uniform. It would cascade across weeks and months, each nation's fate determined by factors most citizens never considered important. The United States enters the post-war world as a geographic paradox. Too large to manage under crisis conditions. Too diverse to maintain unity when federal power dissolves. Too dependent on just-in-time logistics to feed its 335 million people when supply chains collapse. The first fracture would be administrative, not physical. When Washington loses the ability to project authority, when communication networks fragment, when the federal government relocates to continuity facilities deep underground, state and regional governance fills the vacuum. This is not secession. It's necessity. Decisions about water allocation, food distribution, and radiation protocols cannot wait for federal coordination that might not come. Within 30 days, the United States functionally operates as 6 to 8 regional zones. The boundaries follow watersheds, agricultural capacity, and existing state clusters rather than the old divisions of north, south, east, west. A Great Lakes region stabilizes fastest. Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, Ohio. 20% of the world's fresh surface water sits within their borders. Agricultural land remains productive. Major cities like Chicago and Detroit suffer population collapse as urban residents migrate to rural counties, but the infrastructure for food production survives. The challenge is not resources. It's distribution without fuel. The Mountain West becomes a patchwork of survival zones. Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas. Low population density works in their favor. Missile fields at Malmstrom, Warren, and Minute Air Force bases are primary targets, creating fallout zones that render thousands of square miles temporarily uninhabitable. But beyond the radiation perimeters, these states possess something increasingly valuable: space, distance from targets. Small communities that already know how to function with limited infrastructure. The Southwest faces existential crisis. California, Arizona, Nevada. 40 million people sustained by water, imported across hundreds of miles through systems requiring constant energy input. When the Colorado River Compact collapses, when the pumps stop moving water uphill from reservoirs, when desalination plants lose power, the population faces a choice: migrate or die. The exodus would be the largest internal displacement in American history. 10 million people moving north and east over 6 months, carrying what they can, abandoning cities built in deserts that never should have supported such density. The Southeast fragments differently. Texas operates semi-independently, its existing power grid and oil infrastructure providing a foundation for regional autonomy. The Gulf Coast states struggle with contamination, chemical facilities damaged in the chaos, releasing toxins that render water supplies unusable. Florida's population, heavily concentrated in coastal cities vulnerable to supply disruption, compresses inland. The elderly die in significant numbers, not from violence, but from lack of medication, climate control, and medical care. The Northeast, dense with population and dependent on food imports, faces the arithmetic of survival. 50 million people, limited agricultural land, cold winters requiring heat. The calculation is simple and brutal. Carry capacity cannot support current population. Migration, starvation, or aggressive resource consolidation become the only options. By the end of the first year, the United States exists as a federation in name only. Regional authorities make decisions about trade, security, and resource allocation. Some areas maintain communication and coordination. Others drift into isolation. The old economy, based on service industries, finance, and global trade, is replaced by agricultural production, water management, and local manufacturing. Cities shrink. Rural areas gain importance. The population declines not primarily from war, but from the cascading failures that follow. Russia enters the post-war period as the world's largest country facing its oldest problem: how to maintain control over 11 time zones when the infrastructure binding them collapses. European Russia, where 80% of the population resides, absorbs the majority of strikes. Military installations, industrial centers, and government facilities from St. Petersburg to Yekaterinburg become primary targets. Moscow itself, whether struck directly or isolated by surrounding devastation, loses the ability to govern distant territories effectively. The result is predictable. Siberia and the Far East drift toward autonomy, not through rebellion, but through necessity. Vladivostok is 5,800 miles from Moscow. When rail networks fragment, when communication becomes intermittent, when fuel supplies stop arriving, local governance replaces central authority. The pattern repeats across regional capitals. Novosibirsk, Krasnoyarsk, Irkutsk, Khabarovsk. Cities that once took direction from Moscow begin making decisions locally because waiting for federal response means death. Siberia possesses resources that make it viable independently. Timber, minerals, freshwater, agricultural land in the southern regions. The population is only 33 million across a vast territory, creating space for refugees from contaminated European zones. The challenge is not resources, but organization. Can regional authorities coordinate effectively? Can they establish new governance structures rapidly enough to prevent total collapse? The Northern Sea Route, normally requiring icebreakers and maintained infrastructure, becomes inaccessible. Siberia turns inward, focusing on internal stability rather than connection to the wider world. Some regions stabilize into self-sufficient territories. Others fragment further into city-states surrounding population centers. The Russian Federation, as a unified political entity, exists primarily as a historical memory. European Russia faces a different crisis. Fallout from multiple detonations renders significant areas uninhabitable for months. Agricultural production collapses. The population, concentrated in cities, lacks the immediate means to feed itself. Starvation becomes widespread, not in weeks, but across the first winter, when stored food supplies exhaust and spring planting seasons are missed. By year 2, Russia as a global power has ceased to exist. What remains are regional authorities attempting to maintain order, some succeeding, others dissolving into competition over remaining resources. The nuclear arsenal, once a source of geopolitical leverage, becomes irrelevant. You cannot eat missiles. You cannot plant warheads. China's post-war trajectory depends entirely on whether its government maintains internal control during the initial collapse. With 1.4 billion people, the margin between order and chaos is measured in days, not weeks. The immediate challenge is urban. China's coastal cities contain 600 million people concentrated in areas dependent on constant resupply. Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Beijing. These megacities consume more than they produce. When maritime trade stops, when truck deliveries halt, when rail networks fragment, urban populations face starvation on a scale unprecedented in modern history. The government's response would be rapid and absolute. Mandatory relocation programs moving population from coastal cities to interior agricultural provinces. Rationing implemented by force. Movement restrictions preventing spontaneous migration that would overwhelm receiving regions. Success depends on whether communication networks survive to coordinate this massive logistical operation. Interior provinces have the land and water to sustain agriculture. The Yangtze River Basin, the Yellow River Plain, Sichuan Province. These regions grow the wheat and rice that fed China before industrialization. They can do so again if labor returns to the land and if the government can organize distribution. But China's modern economy is built on exports, on manufacturing for foreign markets, on trade relationships that no longer exist. Hundreds of millions employed in factories, producing goods for countries that can no longer pay for them. This workforce must transition to agriculture immediately or become a destabilizing force. The coastal interior divide deepens. Coastal provinces, economically developed but resource poor, lose relevance. Interior provinces, agricultural and less connected to global trade, become the foundation of survival. Provincial governors gain authority as Beijing's ability to micromanage weakens. Tibet and Xinjiang face separate dynamics. Remote, mountainous, already semi-autonomous. When central authority weakens, local populations assert control over their own territories. Not through dramatic revolution, but through Beijing's inability to project force at such distances without functional logistics. By the end of the first year, China either succeeds in coordinating history's largest internal migration and resource redistribution, or it fragments into regional authorities competing for agricultural output. The difference between these outcomes is determined in the first 90 days, when the government either maintains communication and authority or loses both to chaos. Europe enters the post-war world as a testament to interdependence, creating vulnerability. The European Union, designed for cooperation during prosperity, discovers that survival favors isolation. The immediate crisis is energy. Europe imports 60% of its energy needs. Russian pipelines are either destroyed or cut off. Middle Eastern oil stops arriving. Norwegian gas cannot reach continental markets through damaged infrastructure. Without energy, without heat, without the ability to power water treatment and food distribution, European civilization faces collapse within months. The response is national, not continental. Germany closes borders, hoarding remaining coal reserves, and attempting to restart nuclear facilities decommissioned years earlier. France, with its 56 nuclear reactors, possesses the most stable energy supply if the plants survive the war intact. It becomes an island of relative functionality, accepting refugees selectively, guarding resources jealously. Eastern Europe faces direct contamination. If strikes target military installations in Poland, Romania, the Baltic states, fallout zones render agricultural land unusable. Populations migrate west, creating pressure on Germany and Austria. These migrations meet closed borders, armed guards, and the cold arithmetic that refugee populations cannot be absorbed without condemning resident populations to starvation. The Nordic countries stabilize more effectively. Norway, Sweden, Finland, lower population densities, hydroelectric power, fish stocks in territorial waters, cold climate favoring preservation of order through resource discipline. They seal borders, enforce strict rationing, and wait. Southern Europe struggles differently. Spain, Italy, Greece. Dependent on food imports, on tourism economies that vanished, on energy they cannot generate. Mediterranean climates provide agricultural advantages, but soil depletion and water scarcity limit carrying capacity. Urban populations compress into rural areas. Conflicts over land and water become endemic. The United Kingdom faces an island's particular crisis. 56 million people on limited agricultural land, historically dependent on imports for 50% of food supply. When maritime trade collapses, when fuel for fishing fleets runs dry, the population exceeds sustainable carrying capacity. The result is famine, not immediate, not total, but persistent and severe enough to reduce population by 20% over 2 years. By year 3, the European Union exists only as bureaucratic memory. Nations revert to borders, to local food production, to regional alliances based on resource sharing rather than political ideology. The continent's map remains unchanged, but the relationships between countries reset to something resembling pre-industrial patterns. Japan's post-war situation is defined by its geography. An island nation of 125 million people on limited land, dependent on imports for 60% of its food, 90% of its energy. When maritime trade stops, Japan faces immediate crisis. The government response would be comprehensive and rapid. Rationing implemented within days. Fishing industries mobilized. Every available plot of land converted to agriculture. Population relocated from Tokyo, Osaka, and other megacities to rural prefectures where food production occurs. Japan's advantage is social cohesion. A population accustomed to following government directives during disasters. Strong local organizations. Existing emergency management infrastructure. If any large nation can coordinate the transition from industrial to agricultural economy rapidly, it would be Japan. But the arithmetic is unforgiving. Even with maximum agricultural output, current carrying capacity cannot sustain 125 million people. The population must decline or expand territory. With no ability to import food and limited land available, natural attrition occurs. Birth rates were already declining pre-war. Post-war, they approach zero as nutritional stress and social disruption make child-rearing unsustainable for most families. Within a generation, Japan's population stabilizes at perhaps 70 million, still significant, but sustainable on domestic resources. The society that emerges is older, smaller, intensely organized around food production and resource conservation. The technological sophistication that defined modern Japan persists in areas useful for survival. Advanced agricultural techniques, water purification, medicine, entertainment industries, and consumer electronics manufacturing disappear. Australia and New Zealand occupy a unique position, far from likely target zones. Limited strategic importance, reducing probability of direct strikes. Low population density relative to land and resources. Australia, with 26 million people spread across a continent, possesses agricultural capacity, mineral resources, and distance from fallout zones. The challenge is not survival, but adaptation. The economy before war was based on mining exports and trade with Asia. When those markets vanish, the economic structure collapses. But the physical foundation for sustaining population remains. The northern cities, Darwin and Cairns, become entry points for refugees from Southeast Asia if maritime migration occurs. The government faces decisions about border security, about how many refugees can be absorbed without overwhelming domestic resources. Historical immigration debates become survival calculations. Agricultural regions in the south and east maintain productivity. The population does not decline significantly. Living standards drop as imported goods become unavailable, but food security remains stable. By year 5, Australia operates as a regional power, not through military strength, but through being one of the few nations maintaining internal stability. New Zealand, with only 5 million people, and significant agricultural output becomes disproportionately important. Food surplus means trade capacity. Geographic isolation means minimal contamination. The challenge is maintaining social order when global context disappears, when the international frameworks that once governed relations between nations no longer function. South America enters the post-war world relatively untouched by direct strikes. No major nuclear powers on the continent. Limited strategic military targets. Geographic distance from primary conflict zones in North America, Europe, and Asia. The result is a continent that avoids immediate devastation, but still faces profound disruption. Global trade collapses, eliminating markets for exports. But the fundamental resources remain. Agricultural land, water, relatively low population density in many regions. Argentina and Brazil emerge as regional anchors. Argentina's pampas produce wheat and beef. Brazil's interior possesses agricultural capacity, and the Amazon basin provides fresh water reserves. Both nations face internal challenges, social inequality, political instability, but the physical foundation for survival exists. Chile's geography provides natural isolation. Mountains to the east, ocean to the west, agricultural valleys in the central region. The population of 19 million is manageable on domestic resources. The loss of copper export revenue damages the economy but does not threaten survival. The Andean nations face different dynamics. Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, mountainous terrain, indigenous populations with knowledge of high-altitude agriculture. Less integration into global economy means less disruption when that economy vanishes. Ironically, underdevelopment becomes an advantage when advanced infrastructure proves vulnerable. By year 3, South American nations that maintain internal cohesion operate with relative stability compared to devastated Northern Hemisphere powers. They lack the technology and infrastructure of pre-war developed nations, but they possess the resources to sustain their populations. The balance of global power has shifted not through conquest, but through differential survival. Africa's post-war trajectory varies dramatically by region. North Africa, if Mediterranean conflict spreads, faces contamination and disruption. Sub-Saharan Africa, largely peripheral to great power conflicts, experiences the collapse of the global economy that sustained development programs and trade relationships. Nations dependent on food imports face immediate crisis. Egypt, with 105 million people sustained partly by wheat imports, confronts famine when global trade stops. The Nile provides water, but agricultural land is limited. Population pressure becomes unsustainable. Agricultural nations with lower population density stabilize more effectively. Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania in East Africa. Agricultural capacity exists. Political structures, while fragile, maintain some functionality. The challenge is preventing conflict over resources when scarcity intensifies. Southern Africa possesses resources that become valuable in the new order. South Africa's agricultural capacity. Botswana's low population density. Zimbabwe's farmland, if political instability can be managed. But these nations also face the collapse of mining exports that once funded government operations. West Africa fragments along existing fault lines. Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation with 220 million people, faces crisis from its diversity. Ethnic and regional tensions, managed imperfectly before the war, intensify under resource pressure. The country either maintains unity through strong central authority or fragments into regional territories. The fundamental reality is that Africa, long described as underdeveloped, finds that limited integration into global systems means less to collapse. Rural populations practicing subsistence agriculture continue doing so. Urban populations dependent on imports suffer severely. But the continent as a whole avoids the systematic devastation experienced by industrialized powers. The Middle East enters the post-war world as a region where every existing tension intensifies. Oil, the resource that defined its global importance, loses value when global trade collapses. What remains is water scarcity, population pressure, and the infrastructure of conflict built over decades. Nations dependent on desalination face immediate crisis. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait. Their populations are sustained by converting seawater to drinking water, a process requiring constant energy input. When power systems fail, when fuel supplies exhaust, these nations face dehydration within weeks. The populations either migrate or die. There is no middle option. Israel, with advanced water management and agricultural technology, possesses infrastructure that provides advantages. But the country is surrounded by collapsing states, by refugee populations in desperate conditions, by the same resource pressures affecting everyone. Security concerns that were political before the war become existential after it. Iran's population of 87 million faces the challenge of sustaining itself on limited agricultural land. The government either maintains authority and coordinates resource distribution, or the country fragments along ethnic lines. Persian, Azeri, Kurdish, and Arab populations within Iran's borders have different resource access and separate priorities. Turkey occupies a geographic position that provides both advantages and vulnerabilities. Agricultural land in Anatolia, water resources from the Tigris and Euphrates, but also borders with collapsing states, refugee populations, and internal diversity that requires strong central governance to manage. By year 2, the Middle East operates as a collection of survival zones rather than nation-states. Some urban centers maintain functionality. Others empty as populations migrate toward water sources and agricultural land. The political map remains nominally unchanged. The human geography is transformed completely. 5 years after the exchanges end, the world is not empty. It's reorganized. Population has declined from 8 billion to perhaps 6 billion through violence, starvation, disease, and radiation exposure. The survivors live in a world where the old categories of developed and developing, first world and third world, have lost meaning. What matters now is carrying capacity, water access, agricultural land, distance from contamination zones. Nations that possessed these resources endure. Nations that depended on complex systems and global trade collapsed. Power is local. The ability to feed a population matters more than nuclear arsenals that cannot be maintained. Knowing how to purify water outweighs financial expertise. Skills replace credentials. Practical knowledge trumps abstract education. Trade emerges slowly, cautiously, between regions that have surplus and regions that have different surplus. But it's barter, not currency. Grain for medicine. Manufactured tools for preserved food. The economic complexity of the pre-war world will take generations to rebuild, if it ever returns. Some nations maintain their pre-war identities. Others have fragmented into regional territories that govern independently. Borders exist, but they're enforced by local militias rather than national armies. Governments persist where they provide value through coordination and resource distribution. They dissolve where they cannot. The illusion that defined the pre-war world, that humanity had transcended geographic constraints, that technology had made location irrelevant, is gone. Geography determines fate once again. The map of Earth looks the same from space. At ground level, everything has changed. This is what countries look like after World War III. Not erased, but transformed. Not equal in their suffering, but differentiated by the specific vulnerabilities each carried into the conflict. The world continues because ending completely is harder than it seems. Life persists because it has nowhere else to go. What emerges is not the world that was, rebuilt with slight modifications. It's something older, something that operates by rules humanity thought it had left behind. Survival of populations depends not on economic output or military strength, but on the fundamental question every civilization must answer. Can you feed your people with what you have? Nations that answer, yes, endure. Nations that answer, no, do not. The rest is detail.